Boy lost. Wants his mum. Everyone pulls together in this sort of country. You just drop what you're doing and go. You don't question it.
Our hearts are aching and we are holding on to hope that he will be found.
Being optimistic, but being realistic, given the affluction of time, if he's wandered off somewhere on the property, it's hard to see how a 4-year-old could survive in their own resources for this period of time.
Investigation is now being managed by Missing Persons Section, which is part of Major Crime Investigation Branch, and that's where all long-term cases such as this are managed and investigated, which is standard practice.
You would think it'd be quite easy to find a toddler that's just walked away from the sandpit.
Former homicide detective Charlie Bazina says police would be looking at all avenues.
When you're looking at the location of the property, we know we've got dingoes out there, foxes, feral cats, wedge-tailed eagles and the likes. To me, it's starting to look like every indication of, as long as the police are happy with the family and their bona fides, that it may well be a situation where he may have been taken by an animal.
On the evening of September 27, 2025, a grandmother stepped out onto the red dust of an Australian sheep station, called her grandson's name into the wind, and heard nothing but silence. A silence that would grow into one of the most haunting mysteries the outback has ever refused to answer. His name was Augustus Lamont. Everyone called him Gus. 4 years old, blonde hair, bright eyes, the kind of kid who'd chase lizards across the dirt and laugh at the way the wind kicked up dust devils in the afternoon heat. On that Saturday, just before sunset, Gus was doing what he'd done 100 times before, playing outside the homestead on Oak Park Station, a remote sheep property 40 kilometres south of Yunta, in the heart of South Australia's unforgiving interior. His grandmother could see him from the kitchen window, a small figure against an endless horizon, building something in the dirt, lost in the kind of imagination only a 4-year-old possesses. It was 5 o'clock. The sun was still high, but the shadows were starting to stretch long across the gibber plains. 30 minutes later, she stepped outside to call him in for dinner. The mound of dirt was still there. Gus was not. At first, it was the kind of panic every parent or grandparent knows, the gut-drop moment when a child isn't where they're supposed to be. She called his name. Once. Twice. Louder. The wind swallowed her voice. She walked the perimeter of the homestead, checked the sheds, the water tanks, the fence lines. Nothing. The family joined in. They searched every corner of the property they could reach on foot, voices hoarse, hearts pounding. By 9 o'clock that night, when the last of the daylight had bled out of the sky and the temperature began its brutal plunge towards single digits, the property manager made the call that would change everything. South Australia police were notified. A child was missing in the outback. Now, if you've never been to the Australian interior, let me paint you a picture. Oak Park Station sits in what's known as the Mid-North Pastoral Zone, a landscape that looks like Mars had a baby with the surface of the moon. Gibber plains stretch for kilometres in every direction, fields of heat-polished stones that shimmer in the sun and hold that heat long into the night. Low mulga scrub clings to life in the red soil. Dry creek beds carve through the land like scars, bone dry most of the year, waiting for rains that may not come. Fences run in straight lines to the horizon, dividing nothing from nothing. And beneath it all, hidden by dust and time, are the remnants of old mining operations, abandoned shafts, unmarked wells, holes in the earth that could swallow a man, let alone a child. In late September, the weather is deceptive. Days can hit the low to mid-30s Celsius, that's the mid-90s Fahrenheit for my American audience, but when the sun drops, so does the mercury. Nights in the outback can plunge to near freezing. Water is scarce. There are dams, tanks, ephemeral creeks that only flow after storms, but they're few and far between. For a 4-year-old child, alone, without food or water, the survivability window is 48 to 72 hours, maybe less depending on exposure, dehydration, and sheer luck. The clock was already ticking. Within hours of that first call, a Polair helicopter was in the sky, rotors cutting through the cold night air, infrared cameras scanning the ground below. The technology is remarkable. Thermal imaging can pick up the heat signature of a human body against the cooling earth. can spot a person huddled behind a rock or lying in a gully. But the outback doesn't play fair. The stones hold heat. The wind chills exposed skin. Scrub and shadows create false positives. That first night, the helicopter found nothing. By dawn on the 28th, the search had exploded in scale. State Emergency Service volunteers poured in from surrounding towns. The Australian Defence Force deployed personnel. 82 soldiers eventually trained in search and rescue operations. Local landholders opened their gates, saddled their horses, fired up their quad bikes. Mounted police moved through the scrub. Trail bikes roared across the plains. Water operations teams checked every dam, every tank, every place a child might have gone looking for a drink. A grid was established, 2.5 kilometres radiating out from the homestead, divided into sectors, each one methodically swept, logged, cleared. And still nothing. No footprints, no torn clothing snagged on a fence, no small body curled up under a bush. It was as if Gus had simply evaporated into the red dust. Then on the 29th of September, 2 days after Gus vanished, a local Aboriginal tracker made a discovery that sent a jolt of hope through the entire operation. 500 metres from the homestead, near a fence line, he found a boot print, small, child-sized. The tread pattern looked similar to the kind of boots Gus had been wearing. Media picked up the story. Investigators redirected resources. The theory formed quickly. Gus had headed west, toward a dam. Maybe he'd been thirsty. Maybe he'd been chasing something. The search concentrated there, teams moving with renewed urgency, believing they were finally on the right track. Forensic specialists collected the impression. They brought in Gus's boots for comparison, examined the tread under magnification, analysed the depth and angle of the print, and on October 1st, they delivered the news that crushed every ounce of hope that print had generated. It wasn't Gus. The boot print belonged to someone else, a station worker maybe, or a local who'd passed through days or weeks before. It was a gut punch. 48 hours of focused effort, of believing they were closing in, had been spent chasing a ghost. And in the outback, 48 hours is everything. By now, the search had become one of the largest operations South Australia had ever seen. 18 police officers, 82 Defence Force personnel, 33 vehicles, SES volunteers, drones equipped with thermal cameras flying pre-planned grid patterns day and night, helicopters conducting infrared sweeps, ground teams logging every step with GPS breadcrumbs to prove coverage, to ensure no patch of earth was missed. Aboriginal trackers, men and women with generational knowledge of the land, who could read disturbances in the soil that would be invisible to anyone else, moved through the search zones, looking for the kind of sign that technology couldn't detect. But the outback fought back. Harsh winds scattered scent trails, making it impossible for search dogs to lock onto anything. Dust storms rolled through, muddying aerial imagery, turning the landscape into a shifting, unreliable canvas. Heat-retaining rocks confused thermal cameras. Every day the search teams pushed further, covered more ground, checked and rechecked sectors. Every night they returned with nothing. Assistant Commissioner Ian Parrott stood before the media and called it one of the most intensive operations ever undertaken in South Australia. But intensity doesn't guarantee results, not out here. Not when the land itself seems determined to keep its secrets. By early October, after roughly a week of relentless searching, the operation was formally scaled back. That doesn't mean it stopped. Targeted efforts continued, new grids were drawn, probability models were recalculated, but the brutal truth was settling in. The window for finding Gus alive had closed. The search had shifted from rescue to recovery. And still, there was no trace, no body, no clothing, no evidence of where he'd gone or what had happened to him. It was as if the red dust had opened up, swallowed a 4-year-old boy whole and sealed itself shut again. So here's the question I want you to think about, and I want you to drop your answer in the comments below. In a landscape this vast, this unforgiving, where every piece of technology, every trained eye, every ounce of human determination has been thrown at the problem, how does a child simply vanish without a trace? What do you think happened to Gus Lamont? And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because this story is far from over. We're just getting started. The thing about searching for a missing child in the outback is this. Every second you spend looking in the wrong place is a second that child is dying. And when you're dealing with 470 square kilometers of hostile terrain, wrong places outnumber right ones by a margin that'll keep you awake at night. By the time the search entered its peak phase, the operation had become a small army. 18 South Australia police officers, 82 Australian Defence Force personnel, 33 vehicles ranging from helicopters to quad bikes, State Emergency Service, volunteers who'd driven hours from their homes to help, local trackers who knew this land the way you know the rooms of your own house. And every single one of them was hunting for a ghost. Because here's what nobody wants to say out loud, but everyone's thinking, if Gus Lamont was out there, alive or dead, someone should have found him by now. The technology alone should have been enough. Drones equipped with thermal cameras flew grid patterns so precise they could tell you which square meter of Earth had been scanned and when. Helicopters with infrared swept the landscape after sunset, when the temperature differential between a human body and the cooling ground should make a child light up like a beacon. Ground teams carried GPS units that logged every footstep, creating digital breadcrumbs to prove, beyond any doubt, that a sector had been covered. Aboriginal trackers moved through the search zones with an expertise that borders on supernatural. Reading the land for disturbances most people wouldn't even notice. A bent blade of grass, a stone turned the wrong way, a compression in the dust that whispers someone passed through here. But the outback is not a passive landscape, it fights back. Harsh winds tore through the plains, scattering scent trails before search dogs could lock onto them. Dust storms rolled in like walls of red fog, reducing visibility to nothing, turning aerial imagery into useless static. The gibber stones, those heat-polished rocks that cover the ground like a billion tiny mirrors, absorbed the sun's warmth during the day and radiated it back at night, creating false heat signatures that sent thermal cameras chasing shadows. Low-lying mulga scrub obscured sightlines, hid gullies and depressions where a small body could be lying just meters from a search team and never be seen. Every day the teams pushed further. Every night they came back empty-handed, and every hour that passed without a find, the question grew louder. Where the hell is this kid? Then came the boot print, and for 48 hours, everyone believed they finally had an answer. It was September 29th, 2 days after Gus disappeared. A local Aboriginal tracker, someone who'd spent his entire life reading this land, was working a fence line about 500 meters from the homestead when he stopped, crouched down, and called the team over. There, pressed into a patch of softer ground near the fence, was a boot impression. Small, child-sized. The tread pattern looked consistent with the kind of boots Gus had been wearing that day. You have to understand what this meant. For 2 days, searchers had been operating in a vacuum, with no direction, no clue, no evidence of which way Gus might have gone. A 4-year-old's travel capability in terrain like this averages 1 to 3 kilometers per day. But in which direction? North, south, east, west. Without a starting vector, you're searching everywhere, which is the same as searching nowhere. But a boot print, that's a vector, that's a direction, that's hope. The theory formed fast. If Gus had headed west from that fence line, he'd be moving toward a dam, one of the few water sources on the property. Maybe he'd been thirsty. Maybe he'd seen birds circling and followed them, the way kids do, thinking there might be something interesting. It made sense. It fit the profile of a lost child seeking water. Resources were redirected. Teams concentrated on the western sectors. Helicopters focused their sweeps. Ground units moved with renewed urgency, believing they were finally closing in. Forensic specialists collected the impression, photographed it from every angle, measured its depth and dimensions. They brought in Gus's boots, the ones he'd been wearing before he vanished, and compared the tread patterns under magnification. They analyzed the pressure points, the wear marks, the unique characteristics that make every footprint as individual as a fingerprint. And on October 1st, they made the announcement that shattered everything. The boot print was not from Gus. It belonged to someone else, a station worker maybe, a local who'd passed through days or even weeks earlier. The tread pattern was similar but not identical. The size was close but not exact. It was a false positive, a red herring, a cruel trick played by a landscape that doesn't care about hope or heartbreak. Think about that for a second. 48 hours of focused effort, hundreds of man-hours, resources pulled from other sectors, all of it chasing a lead that went nowhere. And in the outback, where a child's survivability window is 72 hours at best, 48 hours is the difference between life and death. So, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or state in the comments. I want to know who's following this story with me. And if you're feeling the weight of this case the way I am, hit that like button. Let's make sure Gus's story reaches as many people as possible. By mid-October, the search grid had been expanded beyond the original 470 square kilometers. Survival experts and search coordinators sat down with maps, probability models, and environmental data and asked the hard question, what if our assumptions were wrong? Lost person behavior models are built on statistics, how far a child of a certain age can travel, which terrain features they're likely to follow, where they'll seek shelter or water. But models are only as good as the data you feed them. And when the data returns nothing, no footprints, no clothing, no body, you have to start questioning the model itself. New sectors were identified. Outlying drainage channels that might have drawn a thirsty child, fence intersections where a wandering kid could have changed direction, brush-covered gullies and gibber fields that had been deemed lower probability, but now, in the absence of any other leads, had to be reconsidered. A supplementary foot team sweep targeted a 95 square kilometre segment where thermal passes had returned ambiguous heat signatures, blips that could have been rocks or animals, or something else entirely. Each adjustment was data-driven, each expansion was justified by the math. But underneath it all was the unspoken truth. They were guessing. Educated guessing, sure, but guessing nonetheless. And the technology that was supposed to make this search foolproof? It was failing. Infrared drones flew dozens of sorties, especially after sunset when the temperature differential should have made a human body stand out like a flare. In theory, it's simple physics. A child's body temperature is around 37 degrees Celsius. The outback ground at night drops to single digits. That's a 30-degree difference. Thermal cameras should pick that up from hundreds of meters away. But theory and reality are two different things out here. Wind-chilled rocks create cold spots. Low-lying scrub traps heat. Kangaroos and feral animals move through the search zones, their body heat triggering false positives that send teams scrambling to investigate, only to find nothing. Every ambiguous signature has to be checked, every blip on the screen has to be cleared, and every false alarm is another hour, another day, another week that Gus isn't found. Sapol also referenced the use of satellite imagery, though they were tight-lipped about the specifics, whether it was commercial providers like Maxar or Planet Labs, or government assets with higher resolution. Satellite feeds can reveal recent vehicle tracks, changes in water levels, disturbed earth where something's been buried or moved. They're incredible for context, for seeing the big picture, for identifying areas of interest that ground teams might have missed. But satellites don't find bodies. They find clues, and in this case, they weren't finding anything. So let me ask you this, and I really want you to think about it. If a 4-year-old boy wandered away from his family's homestead in broad daylight, on a property with limited access and multiple locked gates, how does he leave no trace? No footprints beyond that false lead, no torn fabric on a fence, no disturbance in the dust. How does that happen? Because investigators were asking the same question, and the answers they were coming up with were starting to get dark. The primary hypothesis, the one Sapol kept coming back to, was that Gus had wandered off and succumbed to exposure. Maybe he'd walked further than anyone thought possible. Maybe he'd fallen into an unmarked hazard, an abandoned mining shaft, a concealed well, a dam with steep sides that a child couldn't climb out of. The outback is littered with these dangers, relics of a century of pastoral and mining activity, many of them unmapped, some of them forgotten entirely. Divers checked every known water body on the property. Specialist teams inspected shafts and wells that appeared on old mining records. They found nothing. The abduction theory, the one that always bubbles up in cases like this, the one that gets traction on social media and true crime forums, was publicly dismissed by SAPOL. Assistant Commissioner Parrott was blunt. There was no evidentiary basis for it. Oak Park Station is accessed by multiple locked gates. Traffic through the area is minimal. The idea that a stranger happened to be on the property at the exact moment Gus wandered away, grabbed him without leaving a trace, and escaped undetected. Statistically, it's almost impossible. But almost impossible isn't the same as impossible. And in the absence of evidence, people fill the void with speculation. What if it wasn't a stranger? What if someone on the property knew more than they were saying? What if there was a clandestine mining operation, an illegal well, a hidden pit that no one wanted to admit existed? What if Gus had stumbled onto something he shouldn't have seen? These theories spread like wildfire online. Reddit threads dissected every detail. Facebook groups demanded answers. Armchair detectives pointed fingers, drew connections, built elaborate narratives out of thin air. But investigators don't have the luxury of speculation. They have to follow evidence, and the evidence was saying nothing. So in mid-October, SAPOL made a decision. They established Task Force Horizon, a multidisciplinary team of detectives, search coordination experts, survival specialists, and data analysts whose sole job was to take this case apart and put it back together again. Their mandate was simple but brutal. Assume nothing. Question everything. Review every GPS track, every thermal flight log, every witness statement, every decision made in the first hours of the search. Treat negative evidence, areas that were searched and cleared, as just as valuable as positive sign. Build probability maps that update dynamically as new data comes in. And find the answer to the question that was haunting everyone involved. Where is Gus Lamont? Because here's the thing that keeps investigators up at night. The thing that turns this from a tragic accident into a genuine mystery. If Gus wandered, he should have left more sign. A 4-year-old doesn't move through the outback like a ghost. He stumbles, he falls, he brushes against fences, kicks up dust, leaves scuff marks on rocks. He gets tired and sits down, compressing the ground beneath him. He gets scared and calls out, maybe loud enough for someone to hear. But there was nothing. And that absence, that void where evidence should be, was louder than any clue. Real quick, what time is it where you are right now? Let me know in the comments. And if this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. It helps more people discover what happened to Gus. The Outback community, to their credit, responded with everything they had. Neighboring graziers opened their gates, hosted search teams, shared aerial photos of obscure ridgelines and forgotten corners of their properties. They knew this land, they knew its dangers, and they knew that if Gus was out there, every pair of eyes mattered. Aboriginal trackers, whose involvement was acknowledged by media but whose identities remained confidential, brought a dimension to the search that technology couldn't replicate. These were people who could look at a patch of ground and tell you not just that someone had passed through, but when and how fast, and whether they were walking with purpose or wandering aimlessly. They checked likely travel corridors, re-examined grounds around fence lines and creek beds, looked for the kind of micro-disturbances that a child's footsteps would leave. And they found nothing. Which brings us to the question that Task Force Horizon is still trying to answer. The question that hangs over this entire case, like the red dust that coats everything in the outback. If Gus Lamont didn't wander far enough to be found, and he wasn't abducted, and he didn't fall into a known hazard, then what the hell happened to him? I want to know what you think. Drop your theories in the comments. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're not done with this story. Not by a long shot. Here's the equation that's been keeping investigators awake at night. The formula that refuses to balance no matter how many times they run the numbers. 1 4-year-old boy, plus 470 square kilometers of search terrain, plus cutting-edge technology, plus hundreds of trained personnel, minus any trace, any clue, any evidence, equals what exactly? Because in the world of search and rescue, in the cold mathematics of probability and evidence, that equation should be impossible. And yet here we are, months later, and Gus Lamont is still missing. Task Force Horizon has spent weeks now doing what investigators do when the obvious answers lead nowhere. They've gone back to the beginning, back to that Saturday evening in late September, back to the 30-minute window between 5 o'clock, when Gus was seen playing on a mound of dirt, and 5:30, when his grandmother discovered he was gone. 30 minutes. That's the entire window. That's how long it took for a child to vanish. They've re-interviewed everyone who was on the property that day. The grandmother who saw him last, the parents, the property manager who made that first call to police, station workers who might have been moving through the area. They've pulled property access logs, checked which gates were opened and when, reviewed vehicle movements recorded by farm trackers and personal GPS units. They've asked for diary entries, personal photos, satellite imagery from anyone who might have captured the property that day. Anything that could reveal an unrecorded movement, an overlooked detail, a piece of the puzzle that was sitting in plain sight all along. And they've gone back to the land itself. Because if there's one thing the outback has taught every investigator who's ever worked a case out here, it's this: the land doesn't lie. It might hide the truth. It might make you work for it. But it doesn't lie. Task Force Horizon identified new areas of interest, micro-topographical pockets that initial probability models had ranked as low priority, but that survivability experts now flagged as worth a second look. Fence junctures where a wandering child might have paused, changed direction, left some small sign that the first sweep missed. Drainage channels that only become visible from certain angles, at certain times of day, when the light hits just right. They've conducted targeted researches of these areas, moving slowly, methodically, treating every square meter like a crime scene. Because maybe that's what it is. Maybe this isn't just a tragic accident. Maybe there's something more here, something darker, something that's been hiding in the red dust all along. But here's the thing about searching for answers in a place this vast. The more you look, the more you realize how much you don't know. Take the hazards, for instance: abandoned mining shafts, unmarked wells, concealed pits left over from a century of pastoral and extraction activity. Some of them are on maps. Some of them are in the memories of old-timers who worked the land decades ago. And some of them, nobody knows they exist until someone falls into one. Specialist teams have checked every known hazard on Oak Park Station and the surrounding properties. They've sent cameras down shafts, drained tanks, probed creek beds. They've used ground-penetrating radar in areas where the soil composition allows it. They've done everything short of excavating the entire property, and they've found nothing. So the question becomes, are there hazards out there that nobody knows about? Places the land has reclaimed, covered over with dust and time, waiting like traps for the unlucky or the lost. It's possible. In the outback, it's always possible. But possibility isn't evidence. And without evidence, all you have is theory. Which brings us back to that boot print, the one that sent the search in the wrong direction for 2 critical days. Investigators have gone over the timeline again and again, asking the hard question: did that false lead cost them their best chance of finding Gus? If resources hadn't been concentrated on the western sectors, if teams had spread out differently, covered different ground in those first 72 hours, would the outcome have been different? There's no way to know. And that uncertainty is its own kind of torture. What investigators do know is this: the initial search was conducted by the book. Grids were established using best practice lost person behavior models. Sectors were swept methodically. GPS logs prove coverage. The technology was deployed correctly. The personnel were experienced. Every decision made in those first hours was justified by the data available at the time. But the outback doesn't care about best practices. It doesn't care about models or technology or experience. It operates by its own rules. And sometimes those rules don't make sense to anyone. I want to know, what's the weather like where you are today? Sunny? Rainy? Cold? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're still with me, if this case has gotten under your skin the way it's gotten under mine, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because this story isn't over. For Gus's family, every sunrise is a reminder that he's out there somewhere, or that he was. Every sunset is another day without answers, Another night of questions that have no resolution. They've held vigils. The community has rallied around them with fundraisers, social media campaigns, a hashtag, Find Gus, that's been shared thousands of times. Volunteers still show up, ready to search, ready to help, ready to do whatever it takes. Because that's what you do in the outback. You don't give up on your own. But hope is a finite resource, and as the weeks turn into months, as the search transitions from active operations to periodic reviews, as Task Force Horizon sifts through data looking for the clue that will crack this case wide open, hope becomes harder to hold on to. The investigators, for their part, carry a different kind of weight. They've done everything right. They've followed every lead, checked every theory, deployed every tool at their disposal. And still they have no answers. That's the thing about cases like this. Sometimes you can do everything right and still come up empty. Sometimes the land keeps its secrets. Sometimes a 4-year-old boy can step away from his grandmother's line of sight and disappear so completely that it defies every logical explanation. But logic isn't the same as truth, and the truth is still out there, somewhere waiting to be found. There are other cases like this scattered across the history of remote Australia. Children who wandered into the bush and were never seen again. Adults who set out on foot and vanished without a trace. Some of them were eventually found, years later, sometimes decades later, when a hiker stumbled across bones in a gully or a farmer discovered remains on a distant corner of his property. Some of them are still missing. The outback is patient. It can hold a secret for a lifetime, but it can't hold it forever. Because here's what investigators know, what they cling to when the frustration and exhaustion threaten to overwhelm them. The smallest clue can change everything. A fleeting heat signature on a thermal pass that was dismissed as a false positive. A faint scrap of fabric snagged on a fence post that someone missed the first time through. A single grain of earth out of place that tells a tracker someone passed this way. In a landscape this vast, the difference between finding nothing and finding everything can be measured in centimeters, in seconds, in the angle of the light or the direction of the wind or the sheer dumb luck of looking in the right place at the right time. And so the search continues, not with the intensity of those first days, not with helicopters and drones and hundreds of personnel combing the plains, but it continues. Task Force Horizon reviews new data as it comes in. Ground teams conduct periodic sweeps of high-probability areas. The public appeal remains active, asking anyone with information, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, to come forward. Because someone somewhere might know something, might have seen something, might hold the piece of the puzzle that brings Gus home. The current status, as of late 2025, is this. No confirmed trace of Gus Lamont has been found. The search has been scaled back but not abandoned. Task Force Horizon remains committed to exhaustively testing every lead, analysing every data point, following every thread until it either produces an answer or definitively leads nowhere. The family's plea is simple. If you know anything, tell us. If you were in the area that day, if you have dashcam footage or satellite imagery or farm records that might show something unusual, come forward. No detail is too small. No lead is too insignificant. Because the alternative, the idea that Gus simply vanished, that the outback swallowed him whole and will never give him back, is unbearable. And so we return to that equation. One boy, plus hundreds of square kilometers, plus all the technology and expertise and determination in the world, minus any evidence, equals a mystery that refuses to resolve. But mysteries don't stay mysteries forever. The outback is vast, yes. Unforgiving, yes. Capable of hiding secrets for years, even decades, yes. But it's not infinite. And it's not infallible. Somewhere in the red dust, in the gibber plains, in the dry creek beds and stony rises of South Australia's interior, there is an answer. A place Gus went that no one has found yet. A hazard that hasn't been discovered. A clue that's waiting for the right eyes to see it. And until that answer is found, the search goes on. Let me leave you with this. Picture that grandmother standing on the porch of the Oak Park homestead weeks after Gus disappeared. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The wind is picking up, the way it always does in the evening, carrying dust and the smell of dry earth. And she's calling his name. Still calling his name. Still hoping, against all logic and probability, that this time, she'll hear a small voice answer back. In the red dust of South Australia, the search for Gus Lamont continues, and until the outback gives up its secrets, his family will never stop looking. Now I need you to do something for me. This case is still open. Gus's family is still waiting for answers. If you have any thoughts, any theories, anything at all that might help, drop it in the comments below, share this video, get Gus's story in front of as many eyes as possible, because the more people who know, the better the chance that someone somewhere has a piece of the puzzle. And if you're passionate about true crime, if you want to stay updated on cases like this, cases that matter, cases that need attention, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe out there. And remember, in the outback, answers are measured not in days, but in persistence, precision, and the unwavering belief that no land is so vast it can hide its secrets forever. The thing is, when you strip away all the technology, all the search grids and probability models and thermal imaging, when you reduce this case to its most fundamental elements, you're left with a question that's as old as humanity itself. How do we find someone who doesn't want to be lost? And I phrase it that way deliberately, because there's an assumption baked into every search operation, an assumption so basic that we rarely examine it. We assume the missing person is stationary or moving randomly or seeking help. We assume they'll respond to their name being called. We assume they'll see a helicopter and wave, hear searchers and cry out, leave footprints and disturb vegetation in ways that trained eyes can detect. But what if those assumptions don't hold? I'm not suggesting Gus deliberately hid. He's 4 years old, for God's sake. But children that age operate on a different logic than adults. They don't think in terms of search grids or survivability windows. They think in terms of games and exploration and following whatever catches their attention in the moment. A lizard darting into a crevice, a bird taking flight, the way sunlight glints off a piece of quartz in the distance. Child psychology experts who consult on lost person cases will tell you that young children often don't understand they're lost. They're just somewhere else, somewhere interesting. And when they hear adults calling their names in urgent, frightened voices, they sometimes hide, because they think they're in trouble, because the tone scares them, because their 4-year-old brain tells them that staying quiet and still is the safest option. It's called the hide and die phenomenon, and it's one of the most heartbreaking aspects of child search operations. Kids have been found deceased mere meters from where searchers passed by, tucked into small spaces, under bushes, in culverts, behind rocks, that seem too small or too obvious to check thoroughly. Could that be what happened to Gus? Could he have heard his grandmother calling, thought he was in trouble for wandering too far, and hidden somewhere so well that multiple search sweeps missed him? It's possible, but the problem with that theory is time. Even if Gus hid initially after hours of exposure, after the temperature dropped and thirst set in, survival instinct should have overridden fear. He should have emerged, called out, made himself visible, unless he couldn't. And that's where the hazards come back into play. Not the known ones, the mapped shafts and marked wells that teams have already checked, but the unknown ones. The outback is old. Humans have been working this land for over 1.5 centuries, digging, drilling, excavating, pastoral operations, mining exploration, water prospecting. Every generation leaves its scars, and not all of them are recorded. There's a phenomenon in remote Australia called subsidence collapse. It happens when underground voids, old mine workings, natural limestone cavities, areas where soil has been eroded by underground water flow, suddenly give way. One moment you're walking on solid ground, the next the earth opens beneath you, and you're falling into darkness. These collapses can be small, 1 meter across, maybe 2, just large enough to swallow a child. And once the dust settles, once the wind redistributes the soil and vegetation begins to grow back over the edges, they become nearly invisible. You could walk past one and never know it was there, unless you were looking for it specifically, unless you knew exactly where to look. Task Force Horizon has consulted with geologists and mining historians, trying to identify areas on Oak Park Station where subsidence might be a risk. They've cross-referenced old mining leases with current topographical surveys, looking for discrepancies. Places where the historical record says there should be workings, but the modern landscape shows nothing. It's painstaking work, and it's far from complete. Because here's the brutal truth, you can't search everywhere. Even with unlimited resources and unlimited time, the outback is too vast, too complex, too full of variables. At some point, you have to make choices about where to focus your efforts, and every choice you make is a gamble that you're looking in the right place. So far, those gambles haven't paid off, but investigators aren't giving up. They can't, because the alternative, accepting that Gus is simply gone, that there will never be answers, that his family will spend the rest of their lives wondering, is unacceptable. There's another element to this case that hasn't gotten as much attention as it deserves, and that's the role of weather in the days following Gus's disappearance. Late September in South Australia is a transitional period, the tail end of winter moving into spring. Weather patterns can be unpredictable, temperature swings are dramatic, and wind, constant, relentless wind, is a defining feature of the landscape. In the 72 hours after Gus vanished, wind speeds across the mid-north region averaged 15 to 25 kilometers per hour, with gusts up to 40. That might not sound like much, but in an environment where evidence is measured in footprints and fabric fibers and scent trails, wind is an investigator's worst enemy. It erases tracks, it scatters debris, it carries scent in unpredictable directions, making it nearly impossible for search dogs to establish a trail, and it creates a kind of sensory chaos. Everything is moving, everything is making noise, everything is in flux, that makes it incredibly difficult to spot anomalies. There's also the dust. The red dust that gives the outback its distinctive color is fine, almost powdery, and it gets into everything. It coats surfaces, fills depressions, obscures details. In the days after Gus disappeared, that dust was constantly being redistributed by the wind. Any footprints he might have left, any physical evidence of his passage, could have been buried under a fresh layer of wind-blown soil within hours. So when investigators say they found no trace, they're not just talking about an absence of evidence. They're talking about an environment that actively destroys evidence, that resets itself daily, that makes the work of searching exponentially harder with every hour that passes. And yet, people have been found in conditions just as harsh. Children have survived longer than anyone thought possible. Miracles happen. Just not this time. Not yet. There's a concept in search and rescue called probability of detection, the likelihood that a search team will actually find a missing person if that person is in the area being searched. It's not 100%. It's never 100%. Even in ideal conditions, with perfect visibility and experienced searchers, the probability of detection for a small stationary object, like a child's body, might only be 70 or 80% on a single pass. In the outback, with its scrub and rocks and visual complexity, that number drops, maybe to 50%, maybe lower, which means that even if searchers passed directly through the area where Gus is, there's a very real chance they missed him. That's why areas get searched multiple times. That's why grids get redrawn and teams go back over ground they've already covered, because every pass increases the cumulative probability of detection. 2 passes at 50% each don't equal 100%. The math doesn't work that way, but they get you closer. Task Force Horizon has been using these probability calculations to prioritize their ongoing efforts. They've identified sectors where the cumulative probability of detection is still below acceptable thresholds, areas that were searched once, maybe twice, but under suboptimal conditions or with limited resources. Those are the areas getting researched now. It's a numbers game, a grinding, exhausting, heartbreaking numbers game, and the numbers haven't been in Gus's favor. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. If you were in charge of this investigation, if you had limited resources and an effectively infinite search area, where would you look? What would you prioritize? Would you keep searching the same high-probability zones, hoping that another pass will reveal what previous passes missed? Or would you expand outward, into lower probability areas, gambling that your initial assumptions about Gus's travel capability were wrong? There's no right answer. Every choice has trade-offs. Every decision is a bet against impossible odds. And that's the position Task Force Horizon finds itself in. They've also had to contend with something that every high-profile missing person case eventually faces: public pressure and amateur theories. Social media has been both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it's kept Gus's story in the public eye, generated tips, mobilized volunteers. On the other hand, it spawned countless theories, some plausible, many not, that investigators have had to spend time and resources evaluating. There are people online who are convinced Gus was abducted by a human trafficking ring, despite zero evidence of any such activity in the area. There are others who believe he was taken by dingoes, even though dingo attacks on humans are extraordinarily rare, and there's been no sign of animal predation. There are conspiracy theories involving illegal mining operations, clandestine government facilities, even, and I wish I was making this up, extraterrestrial involvement. Investigators can't ignore these theories entirely, no matter how outlandish, because buried in the noise, there might be a legitimate lead. So they have to evaluate each one, determine whether it has any evidentiary basis, and either pursue it or dismiss it. It's time-consuming, it's frustrating, and it pulls resources away from more productive lines of inquiry. But it's part of the job, because the one theory you dismiss as ridiculous might be the one that turns out to be true. Though in this case, the most likely explanation remains the simplest. Gus wandered, became disoriented, and succumbed to the elements or fell into an unmarked hazard. No conspiracy, no abduction, just a tragic accident in an unforgiving environment. Simple, but no less devastating. There's something else worth considering, something that doesn't get talked about much in the media coverage of this case: the psychological toll on everyone involved. The family, obviously, is living through every parent's worst nightmare. But the searchers, the police officers, the SES volunteers, the Defence Force personnel, the trackers, they're carrying their own burden. When you spend days or weeks searching for a missing child, when you cover kilometre after kilometre of hostile terrain, when you check every gully and every dam and every possible hiding place and find nothing, it stays with you. You start second-guessing yourself. Did I miss something? Was there a sign I didn't see? Could I have done more? And when the search scales back, when you have to accept that you've done everything humanly possible and it wasn't enough, that's a special kind of failure, even though it's not your fault. Even though the odds were stacked against you from the start, it still feels like failure. Some of the searchers who worked the Gus Lamont case will carry it with them for the rest of their lives. They'll think about him on quiet nights. They'll wonder if there was something they missed. They'll hope that someday, somehow, there will be closure. But closure is a luxury that missing person cases don't always provide. I want to circle back to something I mentioned earlier, the idea that the outback doesn't lie, but it does hide the truth, because I think that's the key to understanding this case. Somewhere in those 470-plus square kilometres of searched terrain, or in the areas beyond that haven't been searched yet, there is physical evidence of what happened to Gus Lamont. There has to be. Bodies don't just vanish, they leave traces, bones, clothing, personal effects. Even in the harshest environments, even after months or years of exposure, something remains. The question isn't whether the evidence exists. The question is whether anyone will ever find it. And that depends on so many variables: the exact location, the terrain features that might conceal or reveal it, the timing of future searches, the weather conditions, the sheer random chance of someone being in the right place at the right time. In other missing person cases in remote Australia, remains have been discovered years or even decades after the initial disappearance. A hiker spots something unusual. A farmer notices bones while checking fence lines. A drought lowers water levels in a dam and reveals what was hidden beneath. It could happen with Gus. Someday, someone might stumble across the answer. And when they do, the mystery will finally resolve. But someday, is cold comfort to a family that needs answers now. So where does that leave us? What's the takeaway from a case like this? I think it's this. The world is bigger and stranger and more unknowable than we like to admit. We live in an age of GPS and satellite imagery and thermal cameras, an age where it feels like every square meter of the planet has been mapped and catalogued and understood. But that's an illusion. There are still places, vast places, where you can disappear without a trace, where the old rules apply, where nature is indifferent to human suffering and human technology. The outback is one of those places. And Gus Lamont is a reminder that for all our tools and expertise and determination, we're still small and fragile in the face of it. But here's the thing. We keep searching anyway. We keep asking questions. We keep refusing to accept that some mysteries can't be solved. Because that's what humans do. We push against the darkness. We demand answers. We refuse to let the lost be forgotten. Gus Lamont hasn't been forgotten. His face is on missing person posters across South Australia. His story has been told and retold in media outlets around the world. Thousands of people who never met him, who have no connection to his family, have followed this case, shared his photo, kept his name alive. That matters. It might not bring him home, but it matters. And who knows? Maybe someone watching this video right now has a piece of information they don't even realize is important. Maybe someone was driving through the area that day and their dashcam caught something. Maybe someone has satellite imagery or aerial photos from their own property that shows a detail investigators haven't seen. Maybe someone remembers something, a vehicle, a person, an unusual occurrence, that seemed insignificant at the time but could be the key to everything. That's why I'm asking you to engage with this story, not just passively watch but actively participate. Share this video. Talk about Gus's case. Keep it in the public consciousness. Because the moment we stop talking about it, the moment we let it fade into the background noise of countless other tragedies, is the moment we give up.